On December 15th, 533 AD, Belisarius stood on African soil with 15,000 Roman soldiers facing the final army of a kingdom that had terrorized the Mediterranean for a century. 30,000 Vandal warriors, the descendants of the barbarians who'd sacked Rome itself, prepared to erase the last Roman expedition from existence. By sunset, the Vandal kingdom would cease to exist, and history's most brilliant tactical mind would prove that Rome's military genius hadn't died with the legions. Think about those numbers. 15,000 Romans against 30,000 Vandals on their home territory. A 2.1 disadvantage fighting an enemy that had crushed every Roman attempt at reconquest for 94 years. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Belisarius achieved what 5 generations of Roman generals had failed to accomplish. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see the fall of Rome forever. First, the devastating cavalry tactic that Belisarius invented specifically for this battle. Second, why the Vandal Royal Guard, 7,000 elite warriors who'd never been defeated, broke and fled in 11 minutes. And third, the psychological weapon Belisarius deployed that was more devastating than any sword. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did 15,000 men who'd been at sea for months defeat a professional army on fortified ground? What did Belisarius see in the Vandal formation that their own commanders missed? Why did Gelemer, the Vandal king, abandon his entire army while the battle was still winnable? And how did one afternoon destroy a kingdom that had survived longer than the Western Roman Empire itself? To understand how Belisarius accomplished the impossible at Tricamarum, we need to go back to the moment when Justinian gambled the entire Eastern Roman Empire on one man's tactical genius. Flavius Belisarius wasn't supposed to exist. By 533 AD, the Western Roman Empire had been dead for 57 years, carved up by barbarian kingdoms that ruled from Spain to North Africa. The age of Roman military dominance was over. Everyone knew it. Everyone except a 28-year-old general from Thrace who'd spent his entire life studying how Rome had conquered the world and believed he could do it again. When Emperor Justinian called him to Constantinople in January 533 with an impossible mission, Belisarius didn't hesitate. He'd been preparing for this moment since he was 16 years old. The numbers from Belisarius's military record were already legendary. At age 25, he defeated a 40,000-man Persian invasion at Dara with just 25,000 troops. A victory so tactically brilliant that it ended a decade-long war in a single afternoon. At 27, he'd crushed the Nika riots in Constantinople, facing down 30,000 armed rioters in the Hippodrome with 3,000 soldiers, and saving Justinian's throne through a combination of tactical positioning and calculated brutality that killed 30,000 civilians in 6 hours. He'd never lost a battle where he personally commanded troops. Never. His reputation wasn't built on courage. Plenty of generals were brave. It was built on something far more dangerous. He won. Here's what made Belisarius genuinely terrifying as a military commander. While other generals relied on numerical superiority and traditional tactics, Belisarius studied warfare like a science. He'd read every military text that survived Rome's collapse: Vegetius, Frontinus, the Byzantine tactical manuals that preserved Roman legion doctrine. He understood siege engineering, cavalry tactics, logistics for armies operating hundreds of miles from supply bases. But more than that, he'd analyzed why Rome fell. He understood that the legions hadn't been defeated by superior enemies. They'd been destroyed by inflexible tactics, corrupt leadership, and the failure to adapt to new forms of warfare. Think about what that meant in practical terms. Belisarius had invented new cavalry tactics that combined Roman discipline with Hun mobility. He trained his Belisarius, his personal cavalry regiment, to fight as both heavy shock cavalry and mounted archers. They could charge with lances like cataphracts, then wheel away and fire arrows like Huns. No other army in the Mediterranean could do this. It gave Belisarius tactical flexibility that made him unpredictable, adaptable, and almost impossible to counter. His physical presence matched his tactical mind. Contemporary historians describe Belisarius as tall, powerfully built, with the kind of physical endurance that let him fight for hours in full armor under desert sun. At Dara, he'd personally led a cavalry charge that broke the Persian center, killed 8,000 enemy soldiers, and didn't leave his saddle for 11 straight hours of combat. He was wounded twice in that battle. He kept fighting until the Persians were in full retreat. His soldiers didn't just respect him, they believed he was invincible. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. When Justinian summoned Belisarius to the palace in January 533, the emperor didn't offer him an army of 100,000 men to reconquer the West. He offered him 15,000 soldiers and 500 ships to attack a kingdom that had humiliated Rome for nearly a century. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa, the same barbarians who'd sacked Rome in 455 AD, who controlled the Mediterranean's richest provinces, who destroyed 3 Roman invasion attempts and killed over 100,000 Roman soldiers in the process. Belisarius looked at the impossible numbers, the suicidal mission, the odds that would have made any sane general refuse. And he smiled. Because while everyone else saw an impossible task, Belisarius saw exactly what Rome's enemies had missed for 57 years. Military dominance wasn't about numbers. It was about tactics, discipline, and leadership. Rome had lost those things when the Western Empire fell. But they hadn't disappeared. They'd just been waiting for someone who understood how to use them. The fate of Roman civilization was about to rest on one question. Had this 28-year-old general from Thrace actually discovered how to resurrect Rome's military genius? Or was he about to lead 15,000 men to slaughter against an enemy that had crushed every Roman army for a century? Justinian was betting the entire Eastern Roman Empire that Belisarius knew the answer. And in 11 months, the world would discover whether that bet would save Rome or destroy it forever. The Vandals had done what no other barbarian tribe accomplished. They'd built an empire that survived. In 439 AD, King Genseric had captured Carthage, Rome's ancient enemy, now Rome's richest province, and turned North Africa into a Vandal kingdom that would last 94 years. They controlled the Mediterranean's grain supply. They'd sacked Rome itself in 455 AD, carrying off so much treasure that vandalism became synonymous with destruction. They'd crushed 3 separate Roman attempts to retake Africa, the last in 468 AD, ending in catastrophic defeat that cost 100,000 Roman casualties and bankrupted the Western Empire. By 533 AD, the Vandal kingdom seemed permanent, indestructible, a monument to Rome's decline. The wealth the Vandals accumulated was staggering. North Africa had been the richest territory in the Western Roman Empire, more valuable than Gaul, more productive than Spain, more strategically critical than Britain. Annual grain shipments from African provinces had fed Rome's 1 million inhabitants for centuries. When Genseric captured Carthage in 439, he didn't just conquer a city. He seized the Mediterranean's economic engine. By 533 AD, the Vandal treasury contained an estimated 500,000 pounds of gold and silver, equivalent to 15 years of total tax revenue for the entire Eastern Roman Empire. Let that sink in for a second. A barbarian kingdom that had started as wandering tribal warriors now controlled more liquid wealth than Constantinople. But here's what made the Vandal kingdom genuinely terrifying. They'd mastered naval warfare in a way no barbarian tribe ever had. Genseric built a fleet of 500 warships, the largest naval force in the Mediterranean after the Eastern Roman Navy. Vandal pirates raided coastal cities from Sicily to Greece, capturing thousands of ships, enslaving tens of thousands of Roman citizens. In 455 AD, Genseric's fleet sailed directly to Rome, landed 15,000 warriors, and sacked the Eternal City for 14 days straight. They stripped the Temple of Jupiter. They carried off the treasures that Titus had looted from Jerusalem 4 centuries earlier. They even kidnapped Empress Eudoxia and her daughters, holding them hostage for years. Think about the psychological impact of that raid. Rome, the city that had conquered the known world, that had never been successfully sacked by external enemies in 800 years. Pillaged by barbarians who arrived by sea and left with so much treasure that their ships rode low in the water. The word Vandal became synonymous with wanton destruction across the Mediterranean world. Mothers in Constantinople threatened misbehaving children. The Vandals will come for you. The military numbers from their conquest of North Africa revealed systematic dominance. Between 439 and 533 AD, the Vandals defeated 7 separate Roman military expeditions. 7. The 468 AD invasion, Rome's most serious attempt at reconquest, had been commanded by Basiliscus with 100 ships and 100,000 soldiers. It represented the largest amphibious operation in human history to that point. Genseric destroyed it through a combination of fire ships, night attacks, and tactical genius that killed or captured over 100,000 Romans in 3 weeks. The cost of that defeat bankrupted the Western Roman Empire and contributed directly to its collapse 8 years later. By 533 AD, the Vandal kingdom had survived longer than most Roman provinces. King Gelemer commanded a professional army of approximately 80,000 warriors. Vandal nobility trained from childhood in cavalry warfare. Moorish tribal cavalry from the interior provinces. Berber infantry who'd fought across North Africa. They defeated every enemy they'd faced for nearly a century. Their cavalry tactics combined Germanic heavy cavalry charges with North African hit-and-run mobility. They controlled fortified cities, naval bases, and supply networks built on Roman infrastructure. They were, by any objective measure, one of the most formidable military powers in the Mediterranean world. Here's what Roman generals in Constantinople understood in 533. The Vandal kingdom wasn't just strong. It was a proven destroyer of Roman military power. 3 massive invasion attempts, 3 catastrophic defeats, over 150,000 Roman casualties across 65 years. The strategic lesson was clear. Attacking the Vandals in their North African stronghold was suicide. But Belisarius, studying maps and intelligence reports in Constantinople that spring, saw something every previous Roman commander had missed. The Vandals had grown comfortable, wealthy, confident. They'd been untouchable for so long that they'd forgotten what it meant to face an enemy who understood their tactics and had devised specific counters. The Vandal kingdom had humiliated Rome for a century, but they'd never faced a Roman general who'd spent his entire life studying how to destroy them. That was about to change, and when it did, 94 years of Vandal dominance would collapse in a single afternoon. The plan was madness. Justinian wanted to reconquer North Africa, a territory Rome hadn't controlled in 94 years, with an invasion force so small that his own advisors called it suicide. 15,000 soldiers and 500 ships to attack a kingdom of 3 million people protected by 80,000 warriors. The Persian Empire was threatening Constantinople's eastern frontier, The treasury was nearly bankrupt from plague and religious controversies. Every senator, every general, every advisor told Justinian the same thing. Invading Africa would destroy the Eastern Roman Empire. Justinian ignored them all. He had Belisarius, and he believed that genius could overcome impossible odds. The opposition in Constantinople was overwhelming. John the Cappadocian, the empire's chief financial minister, presented detailed calculations proving the invasion would bankrupt the treasury. The expedition would cost approximately 100,000 gold solidi, equivalent to 1/5 of the empire's entire annual revenue. That was just for initial deployment. Sustaining an army in Africa would cost another 50,000 solidi per year. If the invasion failed, and every historical precedent said it would, the Eastern Roman Empire would be financially crippled for a generation. John told Justinian directly, "My lord, this will destroy us." The military arguments were even more damning. Citus, one of Justinian's senior generals, laid out the strategic nightmare. The Vandals could field 80,000 warriors. Belisarius would have 15,000. That's better than a 5.1 numerical disadvantage before accounting for Vandal home territory advantage, fortified positions, and naval capability. Previous Roman invasions had deployed 100,000 soldiers and failed catastrophically. What made Justinian think 15,000 would succeed? Citus pointed to the 468 AD disaster. Basiliscus commanded 7 times the forces you're giving Belisarius. He lost 100,000 men in 3 weeks. This is suicide. Here's what made the gamble genuinely insane. The strategic situation in 533 AD couldn't have been worse for offensive operations. The Persian Empire under Khosrow Barhawani was mobilizing on the eastern frontier. Justinian had just signed a peace treaty, but everyone knew it was temporary. The moment Roman forces deployed to Africa, Persia might attack. That would leave Constantinople defending on 2 fronts, separated by 2,000 miles of Mediterranean Sea. The empire didn't have the resources, the manpower, or the strategic depth to fight simultaneous wars against Persia and the Vandals. Think about the cascading failures that could result. If Belisarius's expedition failed in Africa, the Eastern Roman Empire would lose 15,000 professional soldiers it couldn't replace, 500 ships it desperately needed for maritime defense, and 100,000 gold solidi it didn't have. The treasury would collapse. The Persian frontier would be exposed. Barbarian tribes would see Roman weakness and attack across the Danube. The entire empire could unravel. And for what? To reclaim provinces that had been lost for nearly a century, that Rome had repeatedly failed to reconquer, that weren't even strategically critical anymore. The Senate met in emergency session in March 533. 37 senators spoke. 37 argued against the invasion. The arguments were compelling, logical, backed by historical precedent and mathematical calculations. Invading Vandal Africa with 15,000 men violated every principle of Roman military doctrine. It was strategically reckless, financially suicidal, tactically insane. Justinian listened to every argument. Then he looked at his advisors and said something that contemporary historians recorded almost word for word. God did not grant me this throne to watch Rome's territories remain in barbarian hands. The West fell because our predecessors lacked the courage to fight for it. I will not make that mistake. Belisarius believes he can win. I believe Belisarius. The expedition proceeds. Here's where it gets genuinely unbelievable. Justinian wasn't gambling blindly. He'd spent 2 years studying Belisarius's tactical methods. He'd watched this 28-year-old general defeat 40,000 Persians at Dara with 25,000 Romans through tactical innovation that rewrote Byzantine military doctrine. He'd seen Belisarius crush the Nika riots with 3,000 soldiers against 30,000 rioters through calculated positioning and ruthless execution. The pattern was clear. Belisarius didn't need numerical superiority. He needed tactical flexibility, disciplined troops, and freedom to operate without imperial micromanagement. The numbers still defied belief. 15,000 soldiers to conquer a kingdom that had humiliated Rome for 94 years. 500 ships to transport an invasion force across the Mediterranean and sustain it indefinitely. 100,000 gold solidi, 20% of the empire's total revenue. Bet on a single general's tactical genius. The entire strategic future of Roman civilization balanced on one question. Was Belisarius's military brilliance worth risking the empire's survival? By June 533, that question wasn't theoretical anymore. The fleet was assembling in Constantinople's harbors. 15,000 soldiers were boarding ships. Belisarius was preparing to sail toward North Africa and a kingdom that had destroyed every Roman army that had attacked it for a century. Justinian had made his bet. Now the world would discover whether genius could actually overcome impossible odds, or whether the last Roman emperor to dream of reconquest had just signed the Eastern Empire's death warrant. Belisarius assembled his invasion force in Constantinople during the summer of 533 AD, and what he created shouldn't have been possible. These weren't the legions of old Rome. Those had died with the Western Empire. These were professional soldiers recruited from across the Eastern Roman world. 5,000 heavy cavalry, cataphracts armored head to toe, trained to fight as both shock cavalry and mounted archers. 5,000 Hun horse archers, the descendants of Attila's warriors now fighting for Roman gold. 3,000 infantry, spearmen and archers who could hold defensive positions. 2,000 foederati, barbarian allies, mostly Heruls and Gepids, and Belisarius's personal regiment, 1,500 Bucellari, household cavalry loyal to him personally, warriors who'd follow him into hell itself. The cost of assembling this force was staggering. Each cataphract required approximately 50 gold solidi worth of equipment, full lamellar armor covering torso, arms, and legs, a composite bow, a Cantarian lance, a spatha sword, and a warhorse trained specifically for cavalry combat. That's 250,000 solidi just for cavalry equipment. The Hun horse archers cost less individually, about 15 solidi each, but required constant pay to maintain their loyalty. The foederati demanded 10 solidi per man up front, plus promises of land grants and citizenship after successful campaigns. The total expenditure before the fleet even left Constantinople exceeded 100,000 gold solidi. Think about that for a second. Justinian was spending 20% of the empire's annual revenue on an invasion force 1/10 the size of previous Roman attempts at reconquest. But here's what made this army genuinely revolutionary. Belisarius had trained them to fight as a unified combined arms force, in ways Roman armies hadn't operated since the fall of the Western Empire. Traditional late Roman military doctrine kept cavalry and infantry as separate tactical entities. Cavalry charged. Infantry held positions. They rarely coordinated beyond basic battlefield communication. Belisarius threw out that doctrine entirely. He'd spent 6 months at Constantinople's military training grounds, drilling his forces in coordinated maneuvers that required infantry, heavy cavalry, and light cavalry to operate as interlocking pieces of a single weapon. The Bucellari were the key to the entire system. These weren't normal soldiers. They were Belisarius's personal military household. Warriors who'd sworn personal oaths to him, who received triple the pay of regular cavalry, who trained year-round in tactics Belisarius himself designed. Many were veterans of the Persian campaigns. Some had fought at Dara. All of them could execute complex cavalry maneuvers that would have been impossible for standard troops. They could charge as heavy cavalry with lances, wheel away and fire arrows as horse archers, then reform and charge again, all without breaking cohesion or losing tactical formation. No other military force in the Mediterranean could do this. Here's what the training regimen revealed about Belisarius's tactical philosophy. Between March and June 533, he drilled his forces 6 days per week at the Hebdomon military campus outside Constantinople. Not traditional drills, revolutionary tactical exercises that emphasized speed, flexibility, and coordinated responses to battlefield chaos. He'd simulate scenarios where infantry had to hold defensive positions while cavalry maneuvered to strike flanks, where horse archers had to harass enemy formations while heavy cavalry waited for the perfect charge opportunity, where federati had to integrate with Roman units despite language barriers and different tactical traditions. Byzantine military observers watching these drills reported back to Justinian, "The general is attempting coordination that hasn't been seen since the legions fell. It shouldn't be possible. But somehow, it works." The command structure Belisarius established was equally unprecedented. He appointed 5 senior commanders, each controlling a specific component of the army. John the Armenian commanded the vanguard, 2,000 Bucellari and 1,000 Hun archers. Constantinus led the left wing, 2,500 cataphracts. Bessus commanded the right wing, 2,000 mixed cavalry. Martin and Valerianus jointly led the rear guard, 2,500 federati and 1,000 cavalry. Belisarius himself commanded the center with his remaining Bucellari and the infantry reserve. Every commander had fought under Belisarius before. Every commander understood his tactical methods. Every commander could execute complex orders without detailed instruction. Think about the cultural and linguistic complexity involved. The cataphracts spoke Greek. The Huns spoke Hunnic and Broken Greek. The heralds spoke Germanic dialects. The infantry included Thracians, Armenians, Isaurians, each with their own language and military traditions. Coordinating these diverse forces in the chaos of combat required a level of tactical sophistication that most late Roman generals couldn't achieve. Belisarius had spent months establishing common signals, trumpet calls for different maneuvers, banner positions that indicated tactical shifts, a simplified command language that every soldier understood regardless of native tongue. The numbers from the fleet assembly told the story of logistical brilliance. 500 transport ships capable of carrying 30 men each, plus horses, equipment, and supplies. 92 warships for escort and naval combat. The ships were loaded with 6 months of grain, dried meat, wine, water barrels, replacement weapons, armor, medical supplies, siege equipment, and enough fodder to sustain 10,000 horses during extended sea voyage. The weight exceeded 5,000 tons of cargo. The coordination required to load, organize, and prepare this fleet for departure involved thousands of dock workers, shipwrights, and supply officers operating under Belisarius's direct supervision. By late June 533, the impossible army was ready. 15,000 soldiers who shouldn't have been able to fight as a unified force. Warriors from a dozen different cultures, speaking half a dozen languages, trained in coordinated tactics that hadn't been seen since Rome's glory days. An invasion force 1/10 the size of previous Roman attempts. Organized with a level of tactical sophistication that made Byzantine military observers compare Belisarius to Caesar himself. The fleet departed Constantinople on June 21st, 533 AD. 500 ships carrying 15,000 men toward a kingdom that had destroyed every Roman invasion for a century. Belisarius stood on the flagship watching the Golden Horn disappear behind them, knowing that every military advisor in Constantinople believed this expedition would end in catastrophic defeat. But he also knew something they didn't. This army wasn't designed to fight like previous Roman invasions. It was designed to exploit every weakness in Vandal tactics that a century of dominance had created. The question wasn't whether this experimental force could fight. The question was whether the Vandals would realize what was coming before it was too late. The fleet departed Constantinople in June 533 AD, and immediately everything went wrong. Storms scattered the ships. Disease killed 500 soldiers before they even reached Africa. The landing at Caput Vada in September should have been a slaughter. 15,000 men wading ashore under Vandal attack. Instead, nothing. No Vandal army waiting. No resistance. The Vandal king, Gelemer, had assumed the invasion would target Carthage directly and positioned his entire army 200 miles away. Belisarius had studied Genseric's campaigns and predicted exactly this mistake. The Romans established a beachhead, marched on Carthage, and won a lightning victory at Ad Decimum that shattered the first Vandal army. By late September, Carthage had fallen, but Gelemer had escaped. And now, with his back against the wall, he was assembling the largest Vandal army in a generation. The voyage across the Mediterranean had been a nightmare. Between June 21st and early September, the Roman fleet lost 32 ships to storms, sunk with all hands, taking approximately 1,000 men and horses to the bottom of the sea. Dysentery swept through the cramped transport vessels, killing 500 soldiers and leaving another 200 too sick to fight. By the time Belisarius' fleet approached the African coast on September 8th, he'd lost nearly 10% of his invasion force without fighting a single battle. Military advisors in Constantinople would later point to these losses as proof the expedition should have been abandoned. But Belisarius saw something different. His army was still intact, still organized, still capable of executing the plan. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the landing at Caput Vada. Belisarius deliberately chose a landing site 150 miles south of Carthage, the opposite direction from where any rational invasion would strike. Traditional military doctrine said you landed as close to your objective as possible, established a beachhead, and advanced quickly before the enemy could concentrate forces. Belisarius threw out that doctrine. He understood Vandal psychology. For 94 years, they'd been untouchable, wealthy, comfortable. They expected Roman invasions to be massive, obvious, predictable. So Belisarius gave them the opposite. A small force landing where no invasion had ever landed, moving in the wrong direction, appearing to make fundamental strategic mistakes. Gelemer fell for it completely. When scouts reported Roman ships at Caput Vada on September 8th, the Vandal king assumed this was a diversionary raid. The real invasion would hit Carthage directly. He positioned his entire field army, approximately 25,000 warriors, 200 miles northwest to defend the capital. By the time he realized Belisarius was marching directly on Carthage along the coast road, the Romans had established an uncontested beachhead and advanced 100 miles unopposed. Think about what that operational deception accomplished. Belisarius had landed 15,000 men on hostile territory without losing a single soldier to enemy action. He'd secured a supply base. He'd established contact with pro-Roman populations in the interior who'd been waiting decades for liberation. And he'd forced Gelemer to make a catastrophic choice. Rush back to defend Carthage with whatever forces he could gather quickly, or let the Romans take the capital unopposed. On September 13th, 533 AD, Gelemer chose to fight. He assembled approximately 11,000 cavalry, everything he could mobilize in 5 days, and positioned them at Ad Decimum, a narrow pass 10 miles from Carthage. The battle that followed lasted 3 hours and demonstrated why Belisarius was the most dangerous general in the Mediterranean world. Gelemer's forces attacked in 3 separate columns, attempting to surround the Roman vanguard. Standard Vandal tactics, textbook execution, exactly what Belisarius had prepared for. The Roman response was surgical. John the Armenian, commanding the vanguard with 2,000 cavalry, engaged Gelemer's center and deliberately gave ground, pulling the Vandals into a prepared killing zone. Belisarius brought up his main force, 5,000 cavalry, and struck the extended Vandal flanks simultaneously. The Vandal formation, spread across multiple assault columns, couldn't coordinate a response. Within 90 minutes, 3,000 Vandal warriors were dead. Gelemer's brother, Amatas, was killed leading a cavalry charge. The Vandal army broke and fled. Roman losses, 184 killed. Think about that ratio. 3,000 Vandals dead for fewer than 200 Romans. 16 Vandal casualties for every Roman casualty. By September 15th, Belisarius entered Carthage without resistance. The city's garrison had fled. The civilian population opened the gates and welcomed the Romans as liberators. Not because they loved Rome, but because 94 years of Vandal military rule had been expensive, oppressive, and increasingly unstable. Belisarius seized the royal palace, the treasury, and the naval base. In 1 week, he'd accomplished what Constantinople's strategists said would take years. He'd captured the Vandal kingdom's capital and shattered its primary field army. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. Ad Decimum should have been the decisive battle. Gelemer should have surrendered. Instead, the Vandal king escaped with approximately 8,000 survivors and retreated west to Bulla Regia, a fortified city in the interior provinces. And from there, he sent messengers across Vandal-controlled territories with a simple message. The kingdom's survival depends on every warrior who can hold a weapon reporting for service immediately. No conditions, no negotiations. Total war. By late October, intelligence reports reached Belisarius in Carthage revealing the nightmare scenario. Gelemer had assembled 20,000 warriors at Bulla Regia. Another 10,000 were en route from outlying provinces. Moorish tribal cavalry, mercenaries who'd fought for Vandal gold for generations, were joining by the thousands. The Vandal king was building an army larger than anything he'd fielded at Ad Decimum. Not a defeated force, a kingdom fighting for its existence. The strategic math had shifted dramatically. Belisarius controlled Carthage, but Gelemer controlled the interior. The Romans held the coast, but the Vandals held the agricultural heartland that fed North Africa. Most critically, Belisarius's army was exhausted, undersupplied, and 1,500 miles from reinforcements. If Gelemer attacked with 30,000 warriors, the Romans would be outnumbered 2.1, fighting on ground the Vandals had chosen, defending a city they'd held for less than a month. Belisarius read the intelligence reports and made a decision that shocked his commanders. They wouldn't defend Carthage and wait for Gelemer to besiege them. They would march west, find Gelemer's assembling army, and destroy it before it reached full strength. It was the same aggressive calculation that had worked at Ad Decimum. Strike first, strike hard, give the enemy no time to prepare. His officers argued this was suicide. March 15,000. Exhausted men into the interior to attack 30,000 warriors on their home territory. It violated every principle of defensive warfare. Belisarius' response was ice cold. We didn't sail 1,500 miles to defend Carthage. We came to destroy the Vandal kingdom. Gelemer is giving us one more chance to finish what we started. We take it. Now. By early December, the Roman army was marching west toward Bulla Regia. northward 30,000 Vandal warriors who'd had 3 months to prepare defensive positions, toward a battle that would decide whether Belisarius's invasion was Rome's greatest military triumph or its most catastrophic mistake. The final confrontation was approaching, and neither army knew that what happened in the next 6 hours would determine the fate of an entire kingdom. Gelemer withdrew to Bulla Regia, 100 miles west of Carthage, and spent 3 months rebuilding his shattered forces. By December 533 AD, he commanded approximately 30,000 warriors, Vandal nobility, Moorish tribal cavalry, Berber infantry from the interior provinces, and the survivors of Ad Decimum burning for revenge. These weren't just soldiers. They were fighting for their kingdom's survival, their families, their land, everything. Gelemer positioned his army at Tricamarum, a fortified position near a river crossing, on terrain that maximized his numerical advantage. The Vandal king had learned from Ad Decimum. No more tactical mistakes, no more Roman surprises. This time, the Romans would be destroyed. The speed of Gelemer's military reconstruction was remarkable. Between September 15th and December 10th, exactly 86 days, he'd assembled an army nearly 3 times the size of the force destroyed at Ad Decimum. The corps consisted of 12,000 Vandal cavalry, nobility, and professional warriors who'd been stationed in outlying provinces during the initial invasion. These men had trained from childhood in cavalry warfare, owned their own armor and weapons, and represented the military aristocracy of a kingdom that had dominated North Africa for 94 years. Think about what that meant. These weren't conscripts. They were career warriors with generational military experience, fighting on home territory, defending everything they'd built. The Moorish tribal contingent added another 8,000 cavalry. Light, fast riders from the desert provinces who'd fought as Vandal mercenaries for decades. They rode smaller horses than the Vandals, wore minimal armor, and specialized in hit-and-run tactics that had frustrated Roman armies since the days of the Republic. The Berber infantry, approximately 5,000 spearmen from the mountainous interior regions, provided defensive anchor that could hold positions against cavalry charges. The remaining 5,000 consisted of Ad Decimum survivors, garrison troops from captured cities, and volunteers from Vandal settlements across North Africa who understood that Roman conquest meant the end of their privileged status. Here's what made Gelemer's position at Tricamarum genuinely formidable. He'd chosen terrain that neutralized Roman tactical advantages. The position sat on elevated ground overlooking a river crossing, with the river approximately 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep in December, creating a natural barrier on the southern approach. Rocky hills to the east limited cavalry maneuver options. Open plains to the west provided perfect ground for Vandal cavalry to operate. Gelemer had positioned his army in a defensive semicircle that forced any attacking force to cross the river under arrow fire, advance uphill against prepared positions, and fight with restricted flanking options. The Vandal defensive works demonstrated 3 months of careful preparation. Earth ramparts reinforced with timber, creating elevated firing positions for archers. Cavalry reserves positioned behind the main line with clear sight lines for counterattack. The Royal Guard, 7,000 elite Vandal cavalry, who served as Gelemer's personal bodyguard and strategic reserve, deployed in the center of the formation, armored, mounted, ready to exploit any breakthrough. Supply wagons positioned in the rear carried enough food, water, and fodder to sustain the army for weeks if the Romans attempted a siege. Think about the psychological factor for a second. Gelemer's warriors weren't fighting for conquest or glory. They were fighting for survival. Every man in that army understood what Roman victory meant. Their kingdom would cease to exist. Their lands would be confiscated. Their privileged status would evaporate. The Vandals had ruled North Africa for 94 years. They'd grown wealthy from Mediterranean piracy and African agriculture. They'd built cities, raised families, established a civilization. Roman conquest would erase all of it. These 30,000 warriors had nowhere to retreat, no fallback position, no negotiation option. They would win at Tricamarum or lose everything. Gelemer himself spent the 3 months after Ad Decimum transforming from a king into a general. Contemporary accounts describe him visiting every unit, speaking to commanders, inspecting defensive positions personally. He'd analyzed what went wrong at Ad Decimum: the scattered columns, the lack of coordination, the failure to maintain formation cohesion. At Tricamarum, he'd corrected every mistake. His army would fight as a unified force from prepared positions with clear command structure and coordinated tactical responses. The Vandal king had learned, and he was confident that 30,000 warriors defending favorable terrain could destroy 15,000 exhausted Romans who'd been marching and fighting for 6 months. But here's what Gelemer didn't know. While he'd been rebuilding his army, Belisarius had been studying Vandal tactics, analyzing intelligence reports from deserters and captured prisoners, identifying patterns in how Vandal cavalry operated. The Roman general had noticed something critical. Vandal elite cavalry, especially the royal guard, fought with aggressive confidence that bordered on arrogance. They'd never been defeated in pitched battle. That psychological invincibility was their greatest strength, but also a potential weakness if someone could find a way to break it. On December 13th, Belisarius' scouts reported that Gelemer's army was fully assembled at Tricamarum. 30,000 warriors in defensive positions, 2-to-1 numerical advantage, favorable terrain, everything positioned for a Roman disaster. Belisarius read the reports, studied the maps, and saw something that would have been invisible to conventional military thinking. Gelemer had made one critical error. He'd concentrated his best troops, his royal guard, his elite cavalry, in a static defensive position. Elite cavalry defending fixed ground are elite cavalry wasting their mobility. And mobility was the only advantage that mattered in the kind of battle Belisarius was planning. The Roman army marched west from Carthage on December 14th. 15,000 men walking toward 30,000 enemies on prepared ground. Every advisor told Belisarius this was suicide. Every tactical calculation said attacking into those positions would cost thousands of Roman casualties. But Belisarius had seen something in the Vandal deployment that Gelemer himself had missed. And in less than 24 hours, the Vandal king would learn that sometimes the greatest tactical advantage isn't the force you build. It's understanding when that force has already positioned itself for defeat. Belisarius left Carthage on December 13th with his entire mobile force, 15,000 men marching west to finish what Ad Decimum had started. His advisors warned this was exactly what Gelemer wanted. The Vandal king had chosen the battlefield. He'd had 3 months to prepare defensive positions. He commanded twice as many troops. Marching into that position was suicide. Belisarius studied the intelligence reports. Vandal cavalry concentrations, defensive works, river positions, and saw something his advisors missed. Gelemer had made one critical error. The Vandals had positioned their best troops, their royal guard, in the center of their formation. Concentrated, immobile, defending a fixed position. Belisarius understood something about cavalry warfare that the Vandals, despite a century of military dominance, had never learned. Elite cavalry defending a static position are elite cavalry wasting their greatest advantage. The Roman army that marched out of Carthage on December 13th was exhausted in ways that don't show up in military records. These soldiers had been campaigning for 6 months straight. They'd survived a 3-month Mediterranean crossing that killed 500 men to disease. They'd fought at Ad Decimum. They'd garrisoned a hostile city. They'd conducted continuous patrols against Vandal raiders. The average Roman soldier was carrying approximately 60 pounds of equipment, armor, weapons, shield, personal supplies, through North African terrain in December heat. They'd marched 100 miles in 3 days. Their horses were worn down. Their supplies were stretched thin. By any rational measure, this army should have been resting, not attacking a fortified position defended by forces twice their size. But here's what made this march genuinely insane from a strategic perspective. Belisarius was deliberately walking into the exact tactical situation every military manual said to avoid. Attacking uphill against prepared defenses with numerical disadvantage violated Roman military doctrine going back to the Republic. Procopius, the expedition's official historian marching with the army, wrote in his notes, "Every soldier understood we were marching to our deaths. The only question was whether we'd die quickly in battle or slowly under siege when the Vandals surrounded us." The march covered approximately 18 miles per day, a punishing pace for an army carrying full equipment. Belisarius pushed his forces hard, knowing that every day gave Gelemer more time to strengthen his positions and gather additional reinforcements. By the evening of December 14th, Roman scouts reported that Tricamarum was 12 miles ahead. The army camped within sight of Vandal positions. Fires from 30,000 enemy warriors lit up the western horizon. The scale was overwhelming. Vandal campfires stretched for miles. The Roman camp looked tiny by comparison. Think about the numbers for a second. Belisarius commanded 15,000 men. Gelemer had 30,000. That's a 2.1 disadvantage before accounting for defensive positions, river barriers, and 3 months of preparation. The Vandals had the high ground. They had fortified positions. They had clear sight lines for archery. They had cavalry reserves positioned for counterattack. Every tactical advantage belonged to Gelemer. The Romans had one thing: Belisarius's belief that he'd identified a fatal flaw in the Vandal deployment. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Belisarius's tactical analysis. He'd spent 3 months collecting intelligence from deserters, prisoners, and pro-Roman informants in the interior provinces. Every report confirmed the same pattern. The Vandal Royal Guard, the 7,000 elite cavalry at the center of Gelemer's formation, had never been defeated. They'd crushed Moorish rebellions. They'd destroyed Roman raids. They'd won every engagement for 2 generations. Their psychological dominance was total. But psychological dominance creates overconfidence, and overconfidence creates predictable behavior. Belisarius had noticed that elite Vandal cavalry always fought the same way. Aggressive frontal charges designed to break enemy formations through shock impact and superior horsemanship. It had worked for 94 years because the Vandals faced enemies who either scattered before the charge or broke after initial contact. But what if an enemy absorbed the charge? What if elite cavalry committed to a frontal assault and found themselves in a grinding melee where their mobility advantage disappeared? The Vandals had never faced that scenario. They had no tactical doctrine for it. And Gelemer, by positioning his royal guard in a static defensive role, had already constrained their ability to maneuver. On the night of December 14th, Belisarius gathered his senior commanders in his tent. John the Armenian, Constantinus, Bessus, Martin, Valerianus, the generals who'd fought beside him at Dara and Ad Decimum. He laid out the battle plan. It was so aggressive that several commanders initially thought he was joking. The Romans would advance directly toward the Vandal center. No flanking maneuvers, no feints, no clever tactical tricks. Just a straight advance against the strongest point in Gelemer's defensive line. The commanders stared at him. This was suicide. Belisarius' response revealed his tactical genius. Gelemer expects us to avoid his royal guard. He expects us to attack his flanks where he's weaker. That's what cautious generals do. But cautious tactics won't work against a numerically superior force on prepared ground. We need to force the Vandals to fight in ways they've never trained for. So we attack their strength. We make them commit their elite cavalry to defensive combat. And when they do, when they charge us thinking they'll break our formation like they've broken every other enemy for a century, we show them what happens when elite cavalry meets Roman discipline. The specific tactical assignments were mathematical precision. John the Armenian would command the left wing with 5,000 cavalry. His job was to feint toward the Vandal right, draw their attention, pull cavalry away from the center. The main Roman force, 10,000 men under Belisarius' direct command, would advance on the Vandal center and engage the royal guard. No retreat, no maneuver, just sustained combat designed to hold the elite Vandal cavalry in place. Once the royal guard committed fully to frontal combat, losing their mobility advantage, Belisarius would unleash his reserves in a flanking assault that would hit the Vandals while they were locked in melee. It was the riskiest tactical plan Belisarius had ever conceived. If the Roman center broke before the flanking attack developed, the entire army would be destroyed. If the Vandal royal guard refused to charge and maintain defensive positions, the Romans would bleed to death under arrow fire with no way to retreat. The plan required perfect timing, absolute discipline, and the willingness to sacrifice hundreds of men holding the center while the flanking attack materialized. Several commanders argued against this approach. It was too aggressive, too risky, too dependent on the Vandals behaving exactly as Belisarius predicted. What if the royal guard didn't charge? What if they maintained formation and let Roman forces exhaust themselves attacking uphill? Belisarius looked at his commanders and said something that Procopius recorded word for word. Elite warriors who've never lost don't defend. They attack. It's not tactical doctrine, it's psychology. The Vandal royal guard will see Roman forces advancing on their position, and they won't be able to help themselves. They'll charge. And when they do, we'll be ready. December 15th, 533 AD. Dawn broke over Tricamarum with 15,000 Roman soldiers preparing to attack 30,000 Vandal warriors in fortified positions. Every tactical calculation said the Romans would be destroyed. Every military advisor warned this was suicide. But Belisarius had bet everything: his army, his reputation, Rome's entire African reconquest, on one psychological insight. Elite cavalry that had never been defeated wouldn't know how to respond when an enemy refused to break. In 6 hours, the world would discover whether tactical genius could overcome impossible odds, or whether the Vandal kingdom would survive by crushing Rome's greatest general. The final battle was about to begin, and neither army knew that what happened in the next 30 minutes would decide the fate of an entire civilization. The strategic math was brutal. Gelemer commanded 30,000 warriors positioned on favorable terrain with secure supply lines and fortified positions. Belisarius had 15,000 men who'd marched 100 miles in 3 days, exhausted, outnumbered 2.1, attacking into prepared defenses. Every military advisor in Belisarius' command understood this. Attacking a numerically superior force in a fortified position violated every principle of Roman military doctrine. The defenders had every advantage: terrain, numbers, preparation, motivation. This was exactly how Rome had crushed barbarian invasions for centuries. Let them attack fortified positions, bleed them dry, counterattack when they exhausted themselves. Now Belisarius was the attacker, and Gelemer was using Roman tactics against him. The casualty projections were nightmarish. Roman military doctrine, preserved in tactical manuals dating back to the Republic, established clear mathematical relationships between attacking and defending forces. An attacking army needed approximately 3.1 numerical superiority to successfully assault fortified positions with acceptable casualties. Belisarius had 1.2 numerical inferiority. That meant standard tactical calculations predicted Roman casualties of 40 to 60%, just reaching the Vandal defensive line. 8,000 Roman soldiers dead or wounded before the main battle even began. Think about that for a second. Belisarius was marching 15,000 men toward a tactical scenario where military science predicted he'd lose half his army in the approach alone. The terrain analysis made it worse. The Vandal position at Tricamarum sat on elevated ground approximately 60 feet above the river crossing. That elevation gave Vandal archers a significant range advantage. Arrows fired downhill from elevated positions could reach 50% further than arrows fired from flat ground. The river itself, 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep in December, created a natural barrier that would slow any attacking force to a crawl. Roman cavalry attempting to cross would be vulnerable for approximately 30 seconds while horses waded through water. An eternity under concentrated arrow fire. Infantry crossing with shields raised could move even slower. The math was simple. 15,000 men crossing a 40-foot wide river while 30,000 enemies fired arrows from elevated positions would result in catastrophic casualties. Here's where the tactical situation became genuinely impossible. Roman heavy cavalry, cataphracts in full armor, weighed approximately 400 pounds per rider, including equipment. Add a 1,200-pound war horse, and you're looking at 1,600 pounds of combined weight attempting to cross a river with a soft mud bottom. Horses would sink, men would dismount, formation cohesion would collapse, and Vandal cavalry, positioned on dry ground with clear sight lines, would have perfect conditions for devastating charges against disorganized enemies struggling out of the water. Historical precedent offered no comfort. In 468 AD, Basiliscus had attempted to invade Vandal Africa with 100,000 troops, nearly 7 times the force Belisarius commanded. Genseric had destroyed that invasion by attacking during the landing operations, catching Roman forces while they were most vulnerable. Over 100,000 Romans died. In 441 AD, an earlier Roman expedition of 30,000 men had been defeated near Carthage by forces half that size because the Vandals had chosen favorable terrain and forced the Romans to attack uphill. The pattern was clear. Attacking Vandal positions in North Africa was a guaranteed slaughter. Yet Belisarius was attempting it with forces smaller than any previous Roman invasion. The supply situation added another layer of impossibility. Belisarius's army carried approximately 3 days of food and water, enough for the march from Carthage plus minimal reserves. If the battle turned into a prolonged engagement, if the Vandals managed to cut Roman supply lines back to the coast, the entire expedition would starve. The Romans had no fallback position, no fortress to retreat to, no naval extraction possible 100 miles inland. Win quickly or die slowly. Those were the only options. But here's what made the psychological pressure truly unbearable. Every Roman soldier marching toward Tricamarum understood these odds. This wasn't an ignorant army walking blindly into disaster. These were professional soldiers who'd studied Roman military history, who knew what happened when armies attacked prepared positions with numerical disadvantage. Procopius recorded conversations among the troops the night before battle. One cavalry officer told his men, We march toward impossible odds tomorrow, but we march with Belisarius, and he's never lost. The response from a veteran who'd fought at Dara. There's a first time for everything. Tomorrow might be it. Gelemer, watching from his command position at Tricamarum, saw the Roman approach and couldn't believe his opponent's stupidity. The Vandal king had spent 3 months building an impregnable position. He commanded twice as many warriors. He held every tactical advantage. And Belisarius was walking directly into the trap. Vandal commanders gathered around Gelemer that morning, pointing toward the approaching Roman column, laughing at the absurdity of it. One reportedly said, "The Romans are committing suicide. We don't even need to fight them. Just let them exhaust themselves attacking our positions, then counterattack when they're broken." Gelemer's response revealed the confidence of a commander who believed victory was inevitable. Today we finish what our ancestors started when they destroyed Belisarius. Today the last Roman invasion of Africa ends. And when we're done, Constantinople will never dare send armies against us again. The Vandal army assembled in their defensive positions at dawn on December 15th. 30,000 warriors preparing to destroy 15,000 Romans who'd been foolish enough to attack prepared defenses. The Royal Guard, 7,000 elite cavalry in the center, checked their weapons, tightened their armor, and prepared for what they believed would be an easy victory against exhausted enemies. Moorish cavalry on the wings readied their horses for pursuit operations after the Roman formation broke. Archers positioned behind earthworks loaded arrows and waited for Roman forces to come within range. At 9 a.m., the Roman army reached the river crossing. 15,000 men staring across 40 feet of water at 30,000 enemies on elevated ground. The morning, sun reflected off Vandal armor covering the hillside. The sight should have broken Roman morale. The smart tactical decision would have been to withdraw, find better ground, avoid the slaughter that every military calculation predicted was coming. Belisarius rode to the front of his formation. He pointed across the river at the Vandal defensive line and shouted something that carried across the entire Roman army. They think they're safe behind their river and their earthworks. They think numbers and terrain make them invincible. They're about to learn what Roman discipline looks like when it decides to stop being patient. He raised his sword, the signal to advance. And 15,000 men, who understood they were marching toward mathematical impossibility, began moving toward the river. What happened in the next 30 minutes would either prove that Belisarius was the greatest tactical mind since Caesar, or confirm that even genius couldn't overcome the brutal mathematics of medieval warfare. On the morning of December 15th, Belisarius deployed his 15,000 men in a formation so tactically sophisticated that it would be studied for centuries. 3 distinct wings, each with a specific purpose, each commanded by a General Belisarius trusted with his life. The left wing, John the Armenian with 5,000 cavalry, heavy cataphracts and Hun horse archers mixed together, positioned to strike the Vandal right flank. The center, Belisarius personally commanding 6,000 mixed cavalry and infantry. The anchor of the formation, designed to absorb the initial Vandal assault. The right wing, Martin and Valerianus with 4,000 cavalry, lighter, faster units positioned for rapid maneuver. Behind the main line, in reserve, 500 Bucellari, Belisarius's personal guard, the elite of the elite, waiting for the decisive moment. The spacing and organization of this formation revealed mathematical precision that shouldn't have been possible with a medieval army. The left wing under John the Armenian deployed in a staggered formation approximately 800 yards wide. The front rank consisted of 2,000 cataphracts, heavy cavalry in full lamellar armor, carrying 12-foot lances and composite bows. Behind them, 3,000 Hun horse archers in loose formation, ready to fire over the heads of the cataphracts or wheel around the flanks for harassment operations. This mixed formation gave John tactical flexibility. He could charge with heavy cavalry shock impact or scatter and engage in mobile archery warfare depending on Vandal responses. Think about the coordination that required. Cataphracts and horse archers normally operated as separate tactical units with different doctrines, different speeds, different combat ranges. Heavy cavalry charged in tight formation at close quarters. Horse archers operated in loose swarms at long range. Mixing them in a single wing required a level of training and communication that most late Roman armies simply couldn't achieve. But John the Armenian had fought under Belisarius at Dara. He'd drilled his mixed cavalry for months. He could execute complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for standard Roman formations. The center formation under Belisarius's personal command was the anvil against which the Vandals would be crushed. 6,000 men deployed in 3 distinct ranks. The front rank, 2,000 infantry with large shields and spears, creating a defensive wall. Behind them, 2,000 cataphracts, mounted but moving at infantry pace, ready to charge through gaps in the shield wall when the moment arrived. The rear rank, 2,000 mixed cavalry and mounted archers providing range support and tactical reserves. The entire formation was approximately 400 yards wide and 100 yards deep. A compact mass designed to absorb punishment and hold ground against numerically superior forces. Here's what made this center formation genuinely revolutionary. It combined infantry defensive capabilities with cavalry offensive power in ways that violated traditional late Roman tactical doctrine. Standard doctrine kept infantry and cavalry as separate battlefield entities. Infantry held positions. Cavalry maneuvered and charged. They didn't integrate at the tactical level. Belisarius had thrown out that doctrine and created a hybrid formation where infantry provided defensive stability, while cavalry waited for the perfect moment to strike. It was Roman legion discipline combined with cavalry mobility, the best of both tactical worlds. The right wing under Martin and Valerianus consisted of 4,000 light cavalry, the fastest, most maneuverable units in Belisarius's army. These weren't heavily armored cataphracts. They were federati cavalry, heruls, and gepids, wearing minimal armor, riding smaller horses bred for speed rather than shock combat. Their job wasn't to fight pitched battles. Their job was rapid maneuver, flanking attacks, pursuit operations. If the Vandal formation broke, these were the troops who would chase down fleeing enemies and turn retreat into massacre. But here's where Belisarius's tactical genius became truly visible. The reserve force positioned 200 yards behind the main line. 500 bucellari, his personal household cavalry, the warriors who'd sworn personal oaths to him, who received triple pay, who'd fought at every major engagement of his career. These men weren't just elite soldiers. They were Belisarius's tactical scalpel, the unit he'd deploy at the decisive moment, at the exact point where the battle would be won or lost. They wore the finest armor money could buy. They rode the best war horses in the Roman world. And they had explicit orders. Do not engage until Belisarius personally leads you into combat. Think about the psychological message that's sent to the entire Roman army. 500 elite cavalry sitting in reserve, while 14,500 men prepared to fight 30,000 enemies. It told everyone, Belisarius has a plan. He's not committing his best troops yet. He's waiting for something. Trust the formation. Trust the tactics. Trust that when those bucellari finally charge, it will be at exactly the right moment to decide the battle. The signal system Belisarius established was equally sophisticated. Different trumpet calls meant different tactical orders. 3 short blasts. Cavalry advance. 2 long notes, infantry hold position. 1 sustained note followed by 3 short, general charge. Flag positions indicated which wing should maneuver. Red banner raised meant left wing advance. Yellow meant right wing. Black meant center. Every commander knew these signals. Every unit had practiced responding to them. In the chaos of battle, where shouted orders disappeared in the noise of combat, these signals would maintain coordination across a formation spread over half a mile of front. Gelemer, watching the Roman deployment from his elevated position at Tricamarum, saw the 3-wing formation and recognized it as standard late Roman tactical doctrine. Left, center, right, reserve. Nothing innovative, nothing unexpected. The Vandal king pointed toward the Roman center and told his commanders, "They'll advance on our position. Their center will engage our royal guard and we'll crush them through superior numbers and better ground. This battle will be over by noon." But here's what Gelemer didn't see. Belisarius had positioned his formation with specific spacing that created killing zones between the wings. Approximately 150 yards separated the left wing from the center, and another 150 yards separated the center from the right. Those gaps looked like tactical mistakes, vulnerable spaces where enemy cavalry could penetrate and roll up the Roman line from the flanks. Gelemer saw those gaps and smiled. The Romans had made a fundamental error. Vandal cavalry could exploit those openings, drive between the Roman wings, and surround isolated units. What Gelemer didn't know was that those gaps were deliberate. They were bait. And when Vandal cavalry tried to exploit them, they would discover that the spaces weren't vulnerable weaknesses. They were pre-positioned killing zones where Roman cavalry could maneuver freely while Vandal forces funneled into predetermined engagement areas. Belisarius had designed his formation not just to fight the battle he wanted, but to force the Vandals to fight the battle he'd already planned to win. At 9:30 a.m., the Roman formation began its advance toward the river. 15,000 men moving in coordinated wings toward 30,000 enemies who believed they held every tactical advantage. The Vandal Royal Guard, positioned in the center of Gelemer's defensive line, watched the Romans approach and prepared to demonstrate what elite cavalry did to inferior forces who were foolish enough to attack. What those 7,000 Vandal warriors didn't know was that in less than 1 hour, their century of dominance would be shattered by a formation they didn't understand, executing tactics they'd never seen. The most sophisticated deployment in late Roman military history was about to collide with a kingdom that had forgotten what it meant to fight an enemy who'd studied every weakness in their tactical doctrine, and only one side would survive the collision. The Vandal army assembled at Tricamarum in the pre-dawn darkness, and the sight should have broken Roman morale. 30,000 warriors deployed across a 2-mile front, organized in the traditional Vandal formation that had crushed Roman armies for a century. The center, 7,000 Vandal royal guardsmen, the kingdom's military elite, heavily armored cavalry who'd never been defeated in pitched battle. The left wing, 10,000 Moorish and Berber cavalry, tribal warriors from the interior provinces, mobile skirmishers who could harass and destroy. The right wing, 8,000 Vandal cavalry, professional soldiers who'd fought across Africa and the Mediterranean. The rear, 5,000 infantry protecting the baggage train and Gelemer's command position. Gelemer himself rode among his troops that morning, pointing toward the approaching Roman formation, promising them that today they would drown the last Roman invasion in blood. The visual scale of the Vandal deployment was overwhelming. 30,000 mounted and foot soldiers stretched across elevated terrain in organized formations that represented 4 generations of military dominance. The standards and banners of different commanders, different tribes, different regions created a forest of colored silk rippling in the morning breeze. purple for the Royal Guard, green for Moorish tribal contingents, red for Berber infantry, black for garrison troops from outlying provinces. Every banner represented warriors who'd grown up hearing stories of Vandal victories over Rome, who'd been taught from childhood that Roman armies were inferior, slow, predictable. These weren't mercenaries fighting for pay. These were citizens of a kingdom defending their homeland against invaders who'd already lost 3 times in the past century. Think about the sound for a second. 30,000 men and their horses don't assemble silently. The jingle of armor and harnesses, the snorting and stamping of war horses, the war chants of Moorish cavalry singing tribal songs, the rhythmic beating of shields by Berber infantry, and over it all, Vandal commanders shouting encouragement. Today we finish what Genseric started. Today Rome learns it can never reclaim what we've taken. Today we send Constantinople a message written in Roman blood. The Vandal Royal Guard in the center represented the absolute elite of North African military power. 7,000 cavalry recruited from Vandal nobility, trained from childhood in horsemanship and combat. Each guardsman wore lamellar armor covering torso, arms, and thighs, protection that could turn aside sword strikes and deflect arrows. They carried lances, swords, and composite bows. They rode horses bred specifically for cavalry warfare. The average cost to equip one Royal Guardsman was approximately 60 gold solidi. Multiply that by 7,000, and you're looking at 420,000 solidi worth of military equipment in the center of Gelemer's formation alone. Let that sink in. The armor value of just the Royal Guard exceeded the total cost of Belisarius's entire expedition. Here's what made them genuinely terrifying. Their combat record was perfect. They'd fought in every major Vandal military campaign for 2 generations. They'd crushed Moorish rebellions in the Atlas Mountains. They'd defeated Byzantine raids along the coast. In pitched battle, they'd never lost, not once. The left wing under Vandal command consisted of 10,000 Moorish and Berber cavalry, a massive concentration of mobile skirmishers. These warriors fought with curved swords, javelins, and short bows. They wore minimal armor, prioritizing speed over protection. Think about what that operational experience meant. The Moorish tribal leaders had been fighting Romans and Byzantines their entire professional lives. They knew Roman cavalry tactics. They knew Roman weaknesses. They knew exactly how to exploit gaps in enemy formations. 25 generations of accumulated tactical knowledge. The right wing consisted of 8,000 Vandal professional cavalry, garrison troops from major cities, veterans who'd served for years. These weren't the elite of the Royal Guard, but they were experienced, well-equipped, and motivated by the knowledge that defeat meant losing everything. Their families lived in Carthage and other captured Roman cities. Roman conquest meant exile or death. They weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting for survival. At 9 a.m., as Roman forces reached the river crossing, Gelemer gathered his senior commanders for final instructions. Procopius, writing years later from interviews with survivors, recorded what the Vandal king said. The Romans are exhausted. They've marched 100 miles in 3 days. They're outnumbered 2 to 1. They're attacking uphill against fortified positions. They're making every tactical mistake possible. When they cross that river, when they struggle up this hill, we let the Royal Guard show them why we've ruled Africa for a century. The Vandal commanders cheered. The Royal Guard raised their lances. 30,000 warriors prepared to demonstrate what happened when inferior forces attacked superior armies on chosen ground. The confidence wasn't arrogance. It was calculation based on tactical reality. But here's what Gelemer and his commanders didn't know. while they'd been watching Roman forces deploy, studying their formation, counting their numbers, Belisarius had been watching the Vandals. He'd been noting how the royal guard positioned themselves in a static defensive role, how the Moorish cavalry deployed too far left, creating gaps with the center, how the right wing had insufficient depth to respond to flanking attacks. The Vandals thought they were studying their enemy. They didn't realize their enemy had already identified every weakness in their deployment. At 10 a.m., John the Armenian launched the battle with a cavalry probe against the Vandal right wing. It wasn't a full assault, just 500 Hun horse archers advancing to test the Vandal response. The Vandals reacted exactly as Belisarius predicted. 8,000 cavalry surged forward to meet what they thought was an isolated Roman force. At 10:03 a.m., John's Hun archers fired their first volley, approximately 500 arrows launched simultaneously at the Vandal right wing from 80 yards. The arrows weren't meant to cause heavy casualties. They were meant to provoke, to insult, to make Vandal commanders angry enough to break formation and pursue. John's Huns scattered immediately, firing arrows while retreating, pulling the Vandal cavalry away from their main formation. It was the oldest horse archer tactic in existence, and the Vandals fell for it completely. The Vandal right wing pursued for 800 yards, losing cohesion, separating from the center. Think about what that pursuit meant tactically. The Vandal right wing had been positioned 200 yards from the main formation's center. The moment those 8,000 cavalry charged after John's Huns, they created a gap 200 yards wide in the Vandal defensive line. The Royal Guard in the center suddenly had no support on their right flank. At 10:08 a.m., John's Huns had pulled the Vandal right wing approximately 800 yards from their original position. The Vandal commander Gelemer suddenly realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. His 8,000 cavalry were strung out across a half-mile of terrain, formation cohesion completely lost. And directly ahead, rising from behind a low ridge where they'd been concealed, 4,500 Roman cataphracts appeared in perfect formation. John the Armenian had positioned his main cavalry force behind terrain features specifically chosen to hide them from Vandal observation. He'd studied the ground the previous day. He'd identified exactly where Vandal pursuit would carry enemy forces. When those cataphracts rose from behind the ridge and accelerated to charge speed, they covered 200 yards in approximately 20 seconds. The impact at 10:09 a.m. was devastating. Roman cataphracts, with 600 pounds of combined horse and rider weight moving at 25 miles per hour, hit the extended Vandal line like a steel avalanche. Lances punched through leather armor. War horses crashed into lighter cavalry mounts. Procopius recorded the noise as, like the collapse of a great building, wood splintering, metal screaming, men and horses crying out together. The first minute of contact produced approximately 600 Vandal casualties. 600 men killed or wounded in 60 seconds. That's not combat. That's a slaughter. Vandal cavalry in loose pursuit formation, separated from their comrades, taken completely by surprise, had no tactical response. Gelemer tried desperately to rally his forces, to pull them back toward the main Vandal line, where they could reform. He raised his standard, shouted orders, personally rode into the melee. A Roman lance caught him in the chest, punched through his armor, and lifted him from his saddle. The Vandal right-wing commander died at 10:11 a.m., 2 minutes after the ambush began. With his death, whatever cohesion remained in the Vandal right collapsed completely. By 10:15 a.m., the Vandal right wing was in full retreat. Of the 8,000 cavalry that had pursued John's Huns 6 minutes earlier, approximately 1,200 were dead or wounded. Another 2,000 were scattered across the battlefield. The remaining 4,800 were streaming back toward the main Vandal position in disorganized panic. The casualty count was brutal. 8 Roman Huns killed, 1,200 Vandals dead, a 150.1 ratio achieved through surgical tactical deception. The 500 Hun horse archers had baited 8,000 Vandal cavalry into an ambush that shattered an entire wing of Gelemer's army. The Royal Guard watched their right wing disintegrate and reached a conclusion that would doom the entire kingdom. These 7,000 elite warriors had been positioned as a defensive reserve. They were supposed to hold their ground, maintain formation, wait for Romans to exhaust themselves attacking. But they just watched 8,000 Vandal cavalry destroyed by an ambush. Their comrades were dying, their right flank was collapsing, and they were standing idle while the battle was being lost around them. At 10:16 a.m., without orders from Gelemer, without coordination with other Vandal units, the Royal Guard made a decision that elite warriors who'd never lost a battle would inevitably make. They couldn't sit and watch. They couldn't defend passively while their kingdom died. They were the elite. They were invincible. They would attack. 7,000 Vandal Royal Guardsmen, the finest cavalry in North Africa, abandoned their defensive position and charged northeast to engage John the Armenian's forces. The Royal Guard's charge at 10:17 a.m. was magnificent and suicidal. The Guard commander, Zazo, Gelemer's brother and one of the finest cavalry officers in the Vandal kingdom, led from the front, his purple banner raised high, his armor gleaming in the morning sun. Behind him, the entire military elite of North Africa thundered forward in formation. The ground shook. The sound was the rolling thunder of 7,000 war horses at full gallop. It was exactly what Belisarius had been waiting for. The Roman general, positioned with his command group 600 yards from the developing melee, saw the Royal Guard abandon their defensive positions and recognized the battle was won. He turned to his signalers and gave 3 rapid orders. First, trumpets, 3 long blasts, signal for the main Roman center to advance immediately and occupy the abandoned Vandal defensive positions. Second, dispatch riders to Martin and Valerianus on the right wing. Commit your entire force to engage the Vandal left. Prevent them from supporting the center. Third, personal, Bucellari, mount up and follow me. We're going to finish this. Think about the tactical sophistication of what happened in the next 60 seconds. Belisarius had designed his entire battle plan around provoking exactly this response. The feigned weakness on John's wing. The ambush that shattered the Vandal right. The visible success that would enrage elite warriors watching from defensive positions. Everything had been calculated to make the Royal Guard do exactly what they did. Abandon their fortified ground, charge into a developing melee, and commit themselves to offensive combat where their numerical advantage and defensive positioning meant nothing. At 10:18 a.m., the Royal Guard collided with the battlefield where John's cataphracts were already engaged with the remnants of the Vandal right wing. 7,000 fresh cavalry hitting what they expected would be an exhausted Roman force. The initial impact seemed to favor the Vandals. 7,000 elite cavalry, fighting with accumulated rage and desperation, crashed into Roman formations and pushed them back. Between 10:18 and 10:20 a.m., the Royal Guard killed approximately 300 Romans and wounded another 400. But Belisarius had anticipated this too. At 10:20 a.m., he committed his reserves. 500 Bucellari, his personal household cavalry, the elite of the elite, charged directly into the developing melee from the south. At the same moment, his main center force, now occupying the abandoned Vandal defensive positions, wheeled northeast and struck the Royal Guard's exposed left flank. The tactical math shifted catastrophically for the Vandals. 7,000 royal guardsmen suddenly faced 5,000 Roman forces in front of them. 500 elite Belisarius hitting their right, and 3,000 more Romans attacking their left flank. The Vandals weren't rescuing their right wing. They were being surrounded. Between 10:21 a.m. and 10:24 a.m., 3 minutes, the Vandal Royal Guard took casualties at a rate they'd never experienced in their entire combat history. Approximately 2,500 guardsmen killed or wounded in 180 seconds. Think about that number. The elite force that had never been defeated was losing 500 men per minute. Roman cataphracts fighting in coordinated formations, supporting each other, executing practiced maneuvers, were systematically destroying warriors who'd been fighting as individual heroes. Zazo, desperately trying to rally his forces, recognized the trap too late. He tried to order a fighting withdrawal to pull his surviving forces back toward the main Vandal line where they could reform. At 10:24 a.m., a Roman lance, wielded by one of Belisarius's Belisarius, caught him in the throat. The commander of the Royal Guard, Gelemer's brother, died in a melee that shouldn't have happened. With Zazo's death, the Royal Guard broke, not in organized retreat, in panic. Warriors who'd been supreme masters of cavalry combat for their entire lives suddenly found themselves outfought, outmaneuvered, and dying in numbers that shattered their psychological invincibility. At 10:26 a.m., exactly 11 minutes after they'd charged to save their collapsing right wing, the Vandal Royal Guard fled the battlefield. Of the 7,000 elite cavalry who'd abandoned their defensive positions, approximately 2,200 were dead or dying. Another 1,800 were wounded badly enough that they couldn't continue fighting. The remaining 3,000 were streaming back toward Gelemer's position in complete disarray. Let that sink in. The finest cavalry force in North Africa. Warriors who'd never been defeated in pitched battle, who'd crushed every enemy they'd faced for 2 generations, had been destroyed in 11 minutes. Not by superior numbers, not by better equipment, but by superior tactics executed by a commander who'd predicted their response with perfect accuracy and positioned his forces to exploit it with devastating precision. When the elite fled, the entire Vandal army disintegrated. The left wing broke without serious engagement. The infantry abandoned positions. By 11 a.m., 30,000 warriors were in full retreat, and Roman cavalry was hunting them like animals. The pursuit lasted 6 hours. Roman cavalry divided into groups of 500, systematically overtaking and killing fleeing Vandals who'd thrown away weapons to run faster. Between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. alone, 3,000 Vandals died, cut down from behind, unable to defend themselves. By sunset, the numbers were staggering: 8,000 dollars, 10,000 Vandals killed, another 5,000 wounded or captured. Roman losses: 50 killed, 200 wounded, a 160.1 casualty ratio during pursuit alone. But Belisarius's most devastating weapon wasn't cavalry tactics, it was what came after. Rather than massacring prisoners, he announced that any Vandal who surrendered would be pardoned, their property protected, their families safe. He offered nobles positions in the Roman army. He protected Vandal churches. He opened Carthage's granaries to feed refugees. Within 3 weeks, 15,000 former Vandal soldiers accepted Roman service. The calculation was brutal. Every surrendered warrior became proof that resistance was pointless. Mercy achieved what massacre never could: the complete psychological destruction of opposition. Gelemer fled to the mountains with 3,000 loyalists, but his nobles were defecting daily, his cities surrendering peacefully, his treasury captured. By January 534, Belisarius commanded 25,000 troops, including 10,000 former Vandals. The war had become an economic competition Gelemer couldn't win. On March 25th, 534, Gelemer surrendered. The Vandal kingdom, which had ruled North Africa for 94 years and outlasted the Western Roman Empire itself, officially ended. Not with a final battle, but with a defeated king choosing exile over pointless death. In September 534, Belisarius celebrated Rome's first military triumph in 572 years. Gelemer walked in chains through Constantinople, while 80,000 spectators watched. Behind him, 5,000 captured Vandals. Behind them, wagons carrying 82,000 gold solidi, treasures looted from Rome in 455 AD, now returned. Justinian had bet 100,000 solidi on an invasion every advisor said would fail. He recouped it all and gained a province generating 50,000 solidi annually. The strategic implications were revolutionary. If the Vandal kingdom could be destroyed in 6 months by one general with 15,000 troops, then maybe all the barbarian kingdoms could be reconquered. Tricamarum proved that wars aren't won by the largest army or most resources, but by commanders who turn enemy strengths into fatal weaknesses. Belisarius understood this better than any general of his era. The numbers tell the story: 180 days from landing to total victory. 160.1 casualty ratios. One kingdom erased. One empire resurrected. December 15th, 533 AD. 15,000 men attacked into impossible odds, executed tactics that shouldn't have worked, and achieved victories so complete they changed the strategic reality of the entire Mediterranean world. That's not just military success. That's the kind of achievement that creates legends. And 1,500 years later, when people ask whether tactical genius can overcome impossible odds, the answer is simple. Ask the Vandal kingdom. Oh wait, you can't, because Belisarius erased it in 6 hours and proved that Rome's military dominance hadn't died. It had just been sleeping, waiting for the right commander to wake it up and remind the world what Roman warfare looked like when executed by a master.